Hey, just watched a debate between Nigel Farage and Sarah Lunnon of Extinction Rebellion on LBC. It's from a few weeks ago, but very topical. Obviously, they're still pretty active. Just a disclaimer before I continue here. I'm not a fan of Nigel Farage. I voted Remain. I'm very critical of the Brexit Party. So I don't want this to be interpreted as like an endorsement for Farage as a politician. I still have a lot of issues with him and his party. But this is an issue, for once, that isn't really involving Brexit. It's involving Farage, but it isn't involving Brexit. And that is that he had an interesting conversation. It was actually quite calm. It wasn't a heated row. It was quite calm. But a lot of interesting points were raised, and I think he done a pretty good job, I have to say, of exposing Sarah Lunnon and her extreme movement, along with Roger Hallam. There's a few leaders. A bit that really gave it away to me was near the start, where she said, "So we want to disrupt people." And she claimed that she felt uncomfortable saying that. But that's her explicit aim. They want to disrupt the public. So it's not even a case of, oh, we have to, we've no choice. They want to. Roger Hallam is on record as saying this as well. Because I think actually, I'm going to be raising points that were made in the video and I'll put a link here. I think that for all their talk of they're doing it for the greater good, I think actually there is real cynicism with Extinction Rebellion, and I think they've got a lot of contempt for the wider public. Clearly they believe we're idiots. Clearly they believe the rest of the public that don't support them are idiots who need to be educated to their way of thinking. So there's a real, at best it's a sort of snobby contempt, but at worst it's bordering on sort of sociopathic, I would say. I mean, that just is incredible arrogance. That she would argue they have a right to disrupt and they want to do it. If you push other people, they'll probably say, oh, we don't enjoy it, we're giving up our free time. But it is a choice what methods they use, and they're choosing these methods. And as has been pointed out before, it's targeting the very sort of people that presumably would be most impacted by the sort of alarmist statements they're making. Now, where I would differ from Farage is I am not a climate change skeptic. I do believe there is a real problem going on here. But I don't believe, and I don't agree with his statement that it's like there's just as many scientists who are critical. I think most scientists do believe that human activity influences the negative impacts of climate change, and it is true. We've been seeing some of the hottest summers on record. We've been seeing increasingly violent storms, hurricanes, not necessarily more deadly, because if you look at some of the deadliest tropical storms in history, they actually occurred in the 1970s. The Ebola cyclone, for example, 1970, Bangladesh, about 500,000 people died. Major disaster. 1991, a big cyclone hit Bangladesh that year as well, and another major disaster. So if you look at the past 10 years, there has been stronger storms and hotter weather, not necessarily more deadly though, not compared to previous decades, if you actually look at the statistics, and I have actually researched this a bit. But getting back to this particular interview, she contradicted herself numerous times. Now, I knew the angle that Farage was going to come at, but he done it calmly. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't... And I'm actually surprised that he didn't kind of touch on the disruptive tactics more. But he made an analogy with his own, what he is known for, Euroscepticism. And he made the point that 25 years ago he was in the minority. But what he done was campaigned, and as far as he knows, he never broke the law. And now, of course, we have Brexit, and we have millions of people who want to leave the EU. So I guess the point he was making was their claim that this is the only way forward is flawed. What they say is governments have done nothing. That's dubious for a start. That's an example of Extinction Rebellion's alarmism. It's factually not true. They claim we are only speaking the truth. Big problem, they're not. So when they say governments are doing nothing, that is a lie there and then. In fact, the British government, could it do more? Of course, you can always say governments can do more, but to say it's done nothing is factually misleading. In fact, among developed countries, we have done more than most. There's a lot more that can be done, of course there is. I think, for example, one of the major pressing issues is on plastic waste. They're clogging up the oceans. It's a huge problem. When I get photographs developed at Boots, they have this sort of plastic cellophane cover. It's utterly pointless. So that's an area that needs to be really, really looked at. Interestingly enough, Extinction Rebellion don't seem to focus so much on that one. And of course they leave a right mess wherever they protest. But the thing about Extinction Rebellion is, I do consider them extremists because they have an echo chamber mindset and they have a black and white mentality. We're right, everyone else is wrong, therefore our job is to educate, everyone else. And they're incapable of introspection. Now, to me, this is a characteristic of an extremist, being incapable of stopping for a second and thinking, well, am I wrong? Maybe this isn't working. Maybe my tactics are backfiring. Extinction Rebellion, at least their leaders, Sarah Lunnon, I'm not sure how her name's pronounced, Roger Hallam and others, are not capable of introspection. Particularly Hallam, he's incredibly self-righteous, very, very vain individual. They are totally incapable of sort of introspection, and they'll always say, oh, but we're sacrificing as well. But they're incapable of understanding the anger they are causing by stopping people making a living. And these are not big powerful oil tycoons, these are just ordinary people trying to go about their work. The anger that Extinction Rebellion are causing, I don't think they grasp it. I don't think they understand this. And you can have the most moral campaign in the world, if you get the public against you, it will fail. Because those suffragettes, because they love to make these analogies with the civil rights movement and suffragettes, I would make the point that the suffragettes who planted bombs in letterboxes, who did use more extreme tactics, were not the ones who eventually helped create the paving of the women's suffrage bill in 1928, I believe it was. Universal suffrage in 1918 was partial suffrage for women over, I believe it was over the age of 30. But the point is, they'll say, oh, well, those suffragettes took those methods and look what happened, we got women's suffrage. But there's no evidence to show that the more extreme methods led to that. It was the suffragettes who were determined, energetic, they campaigned tirelessly to change minds. Because when those more extreme suffragettes who planted the bombs, what did that do? All it done was make men convinced that, oh, they're not ready to vote, and other women hostile to them. That's what happened. They were basically seen as terrorists. So it's a more moderate faction that eventually led the way. With the civil rights movement, does anyone really think that it was the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers that made wider change? No, it was Martin Luther King's faction. And I do understand the argument here. Non-violence can seem very fickle when you're being clubbed by police. And by the way, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not 100% in support of that philosophy. The point I'm making, though, is that Extinction Rebellion likes to align themselves with other movements of the past. And actually, Sarah Lunnon contradicted herself. It was brought up that during the war, the country was united against a common enemy. And she pointed out, rightly, that the country was united. People saw the threat and they came united. The difference here, of course, is the vast majority of the public do not support Extinction Rebellion. You ask someone on the street, are they concerned about climate change? They'll probably say yes. They'll probably agree it's a major issue. You ask them, do they support Extinction Rebellion? They'll say no, because they don't like their tactics. The group has around 250,000 people on their Facebook page, and let's say, give or take, a few thousand more who maybe aren't on Facebook, maybe older people and so on. In a country of 67 million. It's not the sort of support the two sides of the Brexit campaign have. So this is not a popular movement. That is something that needs to be understood. Fact one. Fact two, they're not telling the truth. They insist that they're just telling the truth. some of their alarmist sort of rhetoric is that billions will die. Billions. In the next few years, if nothing is done. Billions. Now, if that isn't alarmism, I don't know what is. Nothing in human history has killed billions. Even the very worst pandemic, which was probably the Black Death, killed an estimated 150 to 200 million over several centuries. So, to say that billions will die, we currently have a global population of about 7.5 billion. Even a claim of millions dying is also alarmism. Hundreds of thousands, yes, that is plausible when you get the situation of famines and increasingly violent storms. That's very plausible. You see, the thing about Extinction Rebellion is they're motivated by this idea that they and only they know the truth. So she invited Nigel Farage to come and meet climate scientists. But I would be surprised if all scientists would endorse some of their more extreme claims. That, for example, billions will die. And of course, scientists would be on the side of wanting governments to take action, and I suspect most scientists will say not enough is being done. But the sort of claims that they're making of getting zero carbon emissions, for example, in 5 years, I think is impossible. And unless they realise it's impossible, it's just a pipe dream. It isn't going to happen. What we need to do is focus on a lot of different areas of reducing CO2 emissions. That's one factor. Reducing waste, I think, is a very important factor, particularly being an island nation. I still think we're way too wasteful of food, of plastic. I'm actually in favour of taxing people who use flights very frequently. Not on the average airline passenger going on holiday once a year, but on people who use it, like, including celebrities incidentally. Someone who's flying to the other side of the world once a month, I think it is fair to tax them more, hopefully as an incentive to maybe cut down that extent of travel a bit less. But even if we look at aviation, which is a significant CO2 emitter, what's the solution? I mean, if you shut down airports, what then? I think Extinction Rebellion have this really fatalist mindset. They want us to be living in the dark ages. So what's the point of trying to get the wider public on side by saying, oh, we want to protect future generations, by basically saying to this generation, let's just live in the dark ages. Let's turn off all electricity. Let's not use heat. Let's just live in the dark ages. Because at their core, that is what Extinction Rebellion seem to be really pushing. They'll deny this, but, look at the rhetoric. So, I think it's a waste of time trying to debate Extinction Rebellion activists. They're convinced that their methods are right. I do think, and this might be controversial, but if they believe they have a right to disrupt the public, maybe someone should organise a situation where there is disruption outside their own homes. I'm not talking about violence, I'm not talking about threats, I'm talking about, for example, a human chain. Just a peaceful human chain, no violence, just stop them leaving. Physically stop them from leaving their homes. Not the average members, I'm talking about the leaders. And then see how they like disruption. Because they have this arrogant notion they could do whatever they like. That's how they justify themselves. And they do not understand all those other social movements in history needed wider public support. It's a fact. The civil rights movement was galvanised when people saw peaceful civil rights marchers being beaten up by racist police in Selma. So that attracted support from across the country. Those civil rights marches were not vandalising buildings. Okay, they were committing civil disobedience, for example, sitting in segregated diners. I'm sure it did anger segregationists. But they were not hurting wider American society. That's what Extinction Rebellion's doing. They're trying to disrupt. I mean, my goodness, the Canning Town incident. Targeting one of the cleanest forms of transport. What's that going to do? Encourage people to use cars. But you point these things out to Extinction Rebellion, it falls on deaf ears. They'll just change the subject. You say that to them, they'll just say, oh, but climate change, storms are getting stronger, because they don't like being challenged. I think at core I do think they have a totalitarian streak, in the sense that we could do what we want and everyone else is wrong. But I must admit, they infuriate me with their arrogance. And it isn't surprising the public then start taking matters into their own hands, which isn't a good situation. But what the hell do they expect? I mean, you know, they then say, for example, that incident in Canning Town, apparently a poll of Extinction Rebellion members was against the action, but Roger Hallam and Sarah Lunnon and other leaders have advocated it. They can't now wash their hands of it and say, oh well, we didn't sanction that action. Every time they encourage their members to do these things, to disrupt, they're not being clear what disruption is. You know, so their members can interpret that whatever way they like. But these people are just so arrogant. They're so incapable of introspection. And that is perhaps the thing I find most infuriating about them. Their sheer arrogance. Because they justify themselves that they're morally righteous. And as soon as someone does that, then they're beyond reproach in their mind. So I'm pleased Farage held this woman to account. I'm still going to disagree with Farage in a lot of other areas, so that's that. But you know, they need to be challenged. They need to be exposed. And I would personally like to see them personally facing some of the inconvenience and disruption that they're putting others through. I also think if they do things like glue their hands to buildings, I honestly think, you know, the Met has a lot of things to handle. Knife thugs for a start. I was talking to someone the other day who came out with a conspiracy theory that the Met are in on this, that, you know, Extinction Rebellion are a soft target so they can police that. I'm not so sure that I believe that. However, you know, one does wonder. I mean, on one hand, you want the Met to act against them because they cannot be seen to, you know, they cannot think that they can do what they want without consequence. But maybe there are too many resources being spent on them. They want to be arrested anyway. So, when they glue their hands to buildings, just leave them there. They'll need to use the toilet at some point. You know? Just leave them there. And maybe let them learn their own lesson. Leave them there. You know, because it takes manpower, resources to cut these idiots out. I mean, what putting your hand into a pipe is going to do for climate change, I do not know. I just... And it's not even like they're tying themselves to big oil tycoons, they're tying themselves to each other. It's almost like performance art or something. Leave them there. I honestly think maybe that's an approach that should be tried out. Just leave them. Don't waste police resources. And if the public want to laugh at them, so be it. But you know, Roger Hallam and co are stoking up a dangerous situation here because they're encouraging Extinction Rebellion activists to break the law, to get arrested, to be disruptive. You know, no care the fact a lot of these are young people, how that's going to look on their work record. You know, Hallam and so on don't care about that. But let's just say, you know, let them do it. They'll need to use the toilet at some point. I honestly think this movement is going to cave into itself. But they've caused a lot of damage as it is. You know, we already have a lot of anger in this country over Brexit, and all these clowns are doing is adding to it. It's pathetic.